discretion.
So item number 1 on the agenda is the approval of the meeting minutes from last month. Take a chance to review them.
I have read them. I will move approval. That's something else wants to.
I did have one comment. I think Caitlin showed up late, so it said she was absent. So I don't know if that's how that works.
Yeah, so typically when a member shows up later in the meeting, then that member's name would be shown as part of the item.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
And then at the end, I think
okay.
It also shows her in attendance.
Yeah. Thanks for
on the last page.
The motion second. Everybody, all those in favor?
Aye.
And there's Caitlin. Hello. Item number 2. Public comments. Do we have anybody from the public?
One staff
Don't have
member.
staff member. Okay, staff member. Yeah. Okay.
Sam Sanford from Sandag's Long Range Transportation Planning Division. I'm here to announce a very brief, anonymous, and voluntary survey. This is to support Sandag's Title VI MPO report. Every 3 years, Sandag, as a recipient of Federal Transit Administration funds, has to go through the development of this Title VI report that documents our efforts to support the Civil Rights Act and Title VI component of that. One of those pieces of this report is a summary table depicting the demographic makeup of committees and working groups like yourself, and that essentially inform transportation planning decisions. So with the Chair's permission, I'll distribute the survey to the members of ITOP, and Ariana has kindly agreed to collect those at the end of the meeting or when people are finished.
Is there any action on our part, or just to be noted?
It's just 2 questions. I guess the action would be if you elect to participate in the survey.
Okay, thank you.
Any other public comments? Any comments from the committee members?
Did we address anything regarding the letter that was received from the gentleman last month? I know I didn't end up calling you, Andrea, but
The gentleman from Encinitas?
yes.
Yes, staff will be drafting a letter and distributing that for our review, and then we will send that out to I forget his name. I apologize.
Doug Fisk.
Doug Fisk.
Okay.
Yes.
Are we going to have a chance to look at that?
Yes.
Okay.
I did want to comment, noticing a stronger presence on Facebook from Sandag. If the Sandag goes forward, there's a little survey on there. See updates on transit projects and work that's coming up. I don't know if that's just me noticing it more, or if it's always been that. Anyway, it's great.
Okay. I will pass that on to our communications folks.
Yeah. Great. Move on to item number 3, 4, and 5. These are consent items. Does anybody have any questions on any of those, or any desire to pull any off the consent?
My only comment that I discussed with Lisa was that we did go over item number 3 just a couple of months ago, and it hasn't changed that much, so I see no reason why we cannot accept this as a consent item.
Are we good? Have any questions or comments on any of these 3 items? Pull them off consent from my perspective. But we have them. Those are all information, so we don't need an action, correct? Okay. Well, we're flying through today. Item number 6, Summary of Transportation Committee and Board of Director action.
Yep. Since your meeting in April, Chair Fuller and your performance auditors presented your fiscal year 2018 performance audit to the Transportation Committee. Comments received included bringing back updates on the status of audit recommendations to the Transportation Committee, including an update on the status of implementation of prior audit recommendations. So we'll be taking a report on that to the Transportation Committee soon. So in April, Chair Fuller and the performance auditors presented the FY 18th triennial performance audit results and recommendations and the response to those recommendations from staff to the Transportation Committee. And one of the comments was to bring back on a more regular basis the status of the implementation of the recommendations, which we bring here on a regular basis about twice a year. We haven't been doing that at the Transportation Committee level, but they've asked that we start doing that, so we'll be doing that. On April 27th, the board conducted interviews and considered selection of a candidate for the executive director position, and we are going to be hearing more about the outcome of that in the next couple months. Last Friday, staff presented the transportation cost estimating process to the Transportation Committee, and you're going to hear more about that at today's meeting. And then in addition, the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, which we also refer to as the Senior Mini Grant Program, there was an update provided on the call for projects to the Transportation Committee last Friday, and we expect to bring back an item to your June meeting having to do with the evaluation criteria.
The triennial audit, remember the graph that has the kind of an up and down on both sides for, I believe it was for
the transit operations
for transit.
plan.
That caused a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
I think that should be altered.
Yes, and we will be working with the auditors to update that in the report. And I think that was a comment that also raised with me. So, yeah.
How many interviews were conducted for executive director?
So my understanding is there were 27 or so applications received, and then there was a short list of interviews, and then they narrowed it down to 2 that the entire board interviewed.
The board one hasn't happened yet.
The board interviews happened. It was in closed session, and it was Friday.
If I heard you correctly, you said we'd be hearing more in the next couple of months. So if they've interviewed finalists, but we're not going to hear anything for a couple of months, does that seem to suggest that they're going to reopen the process? Or?
No.
It has to do with just the negotiations.
Yeah, so it's essentially what they did was they just conducted the interviews at the board meeting in April. And so now it's going through the due diligence process, contract negotiations, that sort of thing. So that's what takes a little bit of time. And then, Ariana mentioned 2 months. It could be sooner. It depends on when the board they would announce this through the regularly scheduled meetings.
Okay. And I had just one other question. In some prior meetings, and Ray's not here, we've asked about if there is intended to be at some point an update on it's being called the Plan of Excellence now, the 7-point plan, or if that's not something that would be a particular agenda item. Are there updates being provided in some less formal sense than? Because I think it would be great if we also had an opportunity.
Yeah, it's scheduled for the June 8th policy board meeting, and then for your June 13th, I think it is ITALK meeting. So yeah, you will at your next meeting, you'll have an update on that.
I think that concludes item number 6. Yep. Item number 7 is the appointment of the 2018 Fiscal and Compliance Audit Subcommittee. Looking for volunteers.
I've done it for some number of years. I'm happy to do it again. But if there are other people fighting for that spot, having had the privilege,
so we are looking for subcommittee members. Tracy, you're part of it, whether you agree or not. And so we obviously don't want a quorum, so we can have 3 others, up to 3 others. It's not a very large commitment for this subcommittee, just as a reminder. It's mostly upfront, going through the agreed upon procedures to determine if there are anything additional that you'd like, expanding any of them. We do have a new auditor this year, Jennifer Farr, So it will be a fresh look at the agreed upon procedures. We've finalized the contract, but our task order one for the first year is still in the review process. So I can't have that first discussion until that's signed, which hopefully will be this week or early next. And then the subcommittee can start taking a look and working with the auditor on that. And we also have the ICAP. Going to try to get that included in this AUP review. And then just other communication with the auditor throughout the year. There's usually not a lot, just a couple of times throughout the year, and that's it. So it's pretty light.
I'm coming up to my last year, so I'll be happy to participate in this committee as a final gift or curse.
I would just mention, I think in my experience, Dick's always been very helpful in this regard, and always has some comments that nobody else has ever thought of. And so I would ask perhaps before we definitively make a decision if the staff might reach out to Dick to see if he's willing to do that again, with no disrespect to others. He's,
Yeah. Okay.
So would we need a motion that appointed Stuart and Jonathan and Tracy and Dick pending is okay?
You don't need three, not voting members, you just need two. And the board member can't, you need another one, right?
I just can't call one. Right.
If Dick can't do it all.
Okay.
Okay.
He says
No.
no.
Okay. Okay.
So we'll reach out and let you know, yeah. And you do need a
We don't know.
motion.
I would make that motion to appoint Stuart, Jonathan, Tracy, and Dick pending is okay.
Second.
All those in favor? Lisa's going to stay up here. Item number 8 is the request by the City of San Diego to execute a memorandum of agreement for use of transit commercial paper. Take it away, Lisa.
Thank you. So to my left, we have Ben Battaglia with the Transportation and Stormwater Department with the City of San Diego. He is available to provide additional information or respond to questions at the end of the presentation. We also have a couple other people from the city here, depending on where we go in the conversation. So the City of San Diego commercial paper. This would be for the West Mission Bay Drive Bridge over San Diego project. We'll just call it the project. That's a mouthful. The project itself is, I'm actually kind of excited that this is going to happen. So it's replacing the 4-lane bridge with 2 3-lane bridges, so adding an additional lane in either direction to optimize traffic circulation up to and around Mission Bay Bridge. So this is the big benefit with this would be to the commuters, those in the neighborhoods around Mission Bay areas, and visitors to the communities, those with the beaches, the parks, and SeaWorld. The construction phase is estimated at about $138 million, and the city has been awarded a $103 million federal highway bridge program grant, or HBP federal grant. There's also some other local funds, which includes a $14.8 million local match for the grant that the city as a part of its funding plan. Now the grant funds are allocated on an annual basis and are anticipated to be received over a 6-year period of up to $20 million a year. And that's typically the way these federal grants work. So that left the city with advanced funding the project, a large portion of the project. So they identified some of the funding, but they found that they needed an additional $40 million to move forward on this. So that's where they reached out to us to discuss using commercial paper for this purpose. As part of our commercial paper program, we always have to step back anytime a jurisdiction would like to borrow, and we have a process that we go through. So do they qualify? So on page 2 of your report, we have a list of eligibility requirements and how the city has met those, and to show that they do qualify for commercial paper. We also look at the capacity of the program. So a little recap on this. We currently have $75 million LOC with the bank, and we have available about $42.5 million. We currently, within the program, outstanding, we have for NCTD about $25.5 million. Then we have agreements with the cities of La Mesa and Oceanside. La Mesa for $2 million and Oceanside for $5 million. And that gives us that $42.5 million available. So the city would be, they're requesting majority of that, leaving a little over $2 million for other jurisdictions to borrow against. But although right now we have the $75 million, we do have board approval to go up to $100 million. So if we found that there was a need, if there were other jurisdictions that were interested in borrowing beyond that $2.5 million, we could increase the program an additional $25 million. So for repayment in discussions with the city, they are required to use their Transnet allocation for the repayment of interest and costs of the program. Now, the variations on the repayment, the city has requested to use non-Transnet source, their HBP grant specifically for repayment of the principal. Typically, our repayments begin, they're either straight line for the life of the borrowing, or they begin at the latest at year 3. The city is requesting to wait 5 years until beginning the repayments. And they're also asking for a 10-year repayment term instead of our standard 5 years. Now, we have done this before with NCTD. We actually have a 20-year repayment term. And we have done, I believe, both a 7 and a 10-year repayment term in the past. As part of our process, we always check with our SANDAG General Counsel and our Bond Counsel on qualifications of the project, and just to make sure that everything is in line with our board policy. And because this was kind of an unusual request, we had quite a few discussions with both General Counsel and our Bond Counsel. We had to make sure that this was not going to affect our outstanding debt in any way, that it still would work within the confines of our ordinance and our board policy, and that there are no tax implications to this. So it was determined that this would work. Bond Counsel actually provided some language modifications to our standard memorandum of agreement so that it does work with our bonding agreement, and General Counsel did approve those changes. One note within the MOA is that the city is keeping a pledge of using Transnet for repayment unless another source is available. And that's important because Transnet debt service is the first use of Transnet. And so we're keeping that language in there, but then allowing them to use another source at the time that payment comes due, should they wish. And this also ensures that if the federal grant or other city sources are not available at the time, then we have access to their Transnet before they do. So we'll just then use it for the repayment. The city is allocated approximately $30 million a year, and so there would be no problems with the repayment if we have to go down that path. So asking for a 10-year repayment term instead of the 8. If you looked at attachment 2, and it gives you a snapshot of when they plan to draw and then when the repayment is, you see that it's not a full 10 years. We're asking for the 10 years to provide some cushion in the event the grant does take longer to come in or comes in at a lower amount. So we have some room there. The same thing with the 5-year starting point on the repayment. There is a possibility that it could be paid down earlier than 5 years, or at least a portion of it, but this provides that cushion in the event that, you know, there's a delay in receiving the grant. We put together a PowerPoint. We put together.
What does this annual column stand for? Does that mean debt service, or what is that? Payment? Page 8.
On the right. That would be the annual repayment amount. So it's in the first year, there's only 1 month interest. It's 34, and then the annual for fiscal year 20, that will be a full 12 months worth.
Okay. So they are paying some just interest for the first.
Right, interest, right. And that includes the actual interest on the commercial paper borrowed plus administrative costs, estimated administrative costs. These are all estimates in this, by the way. These, you know, the rates are whatever they are at the time that the commercial paper is drawn, and then as it matures, it rolls into another maturity until repayment. And there's whatever the market dictates. And then there are certain costs they'll have to pay their proportionate share of the costs of the program itself, as do all of those in any of our debt programs. So on this, the slide behind me, what we are trying to depict is kind of a better snapshot of the project in total. So you can see in the first column we have the $138 million or so of the project costs. Get out of your way.
We have copies of it.
And then the city has identified there's some other local funds. Part of it's match, part of it is just other local funds. And then you can see when the grant funds, best case scenario, are expected to come in, and we're drawing against the Transnet commercial paper would occur. The city would have to advance some funds, and that's off to the right, and that's showing the amount that they would have to fund during those first years if all the revenues come in as planned. And you'll see there in 2024 and 2025, there is a little bit of Transnet, their annual allocation used, and that's because of the way our debt covenants are written, where we have to do a set aside every month with the trustee of 1/12 of the annual payment, and so we have to use a little bit of their Transnet funds before that first repayment on the grant, and then it would replenish that Transnet. It would just kind of go back in, so you see the use of it and then the return of it. And that is, in a snapshot, the city's request. This is a discussion item with the ITOC. It is scheduled for the Transportation Committee on the 18th, and then on the 25th would be going to the board for final approval. And at this time, I will open this up for discussion.
I'm gonna abstain from the discussion here, just out of caution of my company is involved in the design of the project, so I know it's a discussion, I'm not sure to stay silent.
Of the $75 million of commercial paper within the program, is that replenished annually, or is that something that is a set amount that can only be outstanding for however long the program is running?
The full amount isn't outstanding. It's only outstanding when we actually loan out the commercial paper. That's just the available within the program at the moment. And we do have, I think it's an annual agreement with the bank, so we can change that at that time if we needed to increase it or expand it beyond.
The point of my question is there's $42.45 million
75
available.
is total, it's not an annual.
Right, so you only have 42 million uncommitted, and you're giving 40 million on one project to the city.
Yes.
Is there any concern about, that means you have only $2 million left out of the 75 that's uncommitted?
Right.
So are you now, with one project, sucking up money that could be used for multiple projects? That would be
Right, and so the board has approved up to 100 million for the program, so we could go back to the bank and say, hey, can we increase it another 25, and that would immediately give us an additional 25 million of capacity available to others.
And the other two projects, the Oceanside and I don't remember, are those also larger?
No, those are small. The Mesa's 2 million, Oceanside is 5 million. NCTD is 25.5 currently, but when that deal first occurred, that was $34 million.
Mm-hmm.
So we have had a couple over the past years where they've been large amounts.
And how often do you guys get applications for this type of paper?
You know, there are inquiries, usually several times a year from different jurisdictions, but they don't always pan out. Currently, the county is thinking about borrowing a couple of years. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know.
So I have a couple of questions. The first of which is, I guess, I don't know if you want to call it a parliamentary question, as to whether it would be appropriate for Dick Fortman had a number of questions that he emailed, if those be read into the record and responded to.
Yep.
Because I'm not sure if the presentation actually answered all of the questions that he had emailed.
Oh, here, you're right at the top. Yeah. Okay. Would you like me to just go into those, if you have other?
Well, I have a couple of others different from his, but it seems like we did have a couple of relevant questions that probably should be addressed for clarity, nonetheless.
Okay. So he was asking about the grant being up to an amount, what if there is a shortfall? So, yeah, and I did address that. So the language that we're keeping in the agreement with the city, that the city is keeping their pledge of using Transnet for repayment unless another source is available. That we wrote that kept that in the memorandum of agreement specifically for that purpose. If it comes up short, if it comes in late, I mean, we still have to have this repaid within a certain period of time. So that's when we would turn to the city and say, hey, you have to start repaying this. So are you going to use another source and, you know, just hand the funds over to us to repay, or should we start using your Transnet? And he was also questioning based on the program capacity of the grant. So that was that's in the funding considerations on page 2, so the second paragraph at the top. The reimbursement of the grant is based on both eligible project costs, project expenditures to date, and the HBP program capacity. So that's, you know, that's where there could be a delay in the grant, because if they only have a certain amount available to all grantees, they have to divvy it up a certain way. So it could be delayed. It could be a larger amount. It could be, you know, more than 20 million. It could be less than 20 million in a given year. It's just that when it's awarded, this is the expectation is the $20 million per year. So that's, you know, what if the capacity does not materialize is Dick's question. That goes back to our keeping that language in the MOA, where we always have the ability to go back to the city's Transnet, their annual allocations, and use those.
So if I could, so that speaks to the repayment, but and I don't know actually what Dick's intent was, but there's another side to this, which is what if the grant doesn't materialize to its full extent, which would that put the project in peril, or would the city then decide to use the full, let's call it 30 million a year that it's getting, and sort of and underfund some other program, or shift funds from some other programs to complete this project?
Yeah, so we have a few options. This project is an extremely important project to the city of San Diego, so funding will not be an issue. We'll make sure that construction continues to proceed. So one of our options is, yes, to shift funding around between projects. You know, the city has hundreds of projects on an ongoing basis. So that's one option. The other option is, if for some reason this grant, this HBP grant of $100+ million just doesn't come in, we're going to be following it very closely. We're anticipating $20 million per year, but if for some reason we're not getting $20 million the first year, we know that we're not going to get $20 million the second year, we'll be reaching out and working with our finance departments, looking at issuing a long-term debt if need be.
Then he also asks, just answered a possible $60 million HBP reimbursement is what happens if it proves to be impossible. So I think we just had that. This leaves the city with a minimum need of 30 to 19 million. I'm not sure how that works. Plus 19. So 49 million. What might the maximum be, and how will it be funded? So let me see answer there. Okay, so that's where where they reached out to us for the $40 million. So the first 3 years of the project are expected to produce approximately $90 million of expenditures. And if the $20 million comes in every year, then there's a possibility of 60 of that being covered. So that left that 30 out there, plus an additional 10 million in future years. So the city reached out to us for the 40. So he's asking, could it be more than just this 40? Could there be more in those first years that the city, if the project moves faster, I guess?
Yeah, it is a possibility. It really depends on the construction schedule and how quickly construction is moving. But this is our best estimate as to what the cash flows are at this time.
And they would have to come back through for approval of additional monies requested?
If the city were to reach out to us and ask to borrow an additional amount, and it seemed like it could work, then yes, we would have to go through this process again.
So thank you for that. I have a couple of other questions. Apologies for belaboring this. It says finance on my tag here, so I feel like I've got to come up with these a couple of just for absolute clarity, so the increased capacity on the commercial paper program has already been authorized by the board. It's a question of implementing that. So. Right. So then, Andre, from a credit perspective, the fact that it's already authorized, the agencies would look at it as if it's not really that much of a difference whether it's issued or not, because if it's authorized, it's almost as good as having been issued. Is that?
Yeah, in fact, when they rate our commercial paper, they're rated on the full 100 million right. As though it's outstanding. The reason why we ratcheted it down to 75 million, because there's a cost with the commercial paper program that's 40 basis points to just have it outstanding. So we know that in general we've gone up to that 75 million, so rather than pay an additional 40 basis points on the 25 million, we ratcheted it back down. And also, just to let you know, Union Bank has the authority to increase up to 150 million, although we'd have to go to the board to get that approval. So I mean, we have a lot of flexibility in the program.
So the other question I had is sort of following up on Caitlin's line of questioning is, to the extent that this exhausts more, practically speaking, the amount that we have in place, I guess I would just kind of question that the term of 8 years versus, which is the plan, expenditure plan, versus the 10 years, because it seems like that cushion is, in a new sort of way, coming at the expense of the ability of the other constituencies to draw, you know, on the existing 75 million. What that doesn't take into account is, I don't know to what extent there would be material repayments from the already existing drawers from the program. And so I don't know if, to ameliorate at least my questioning of the the 10 years versus the 8 years, if you could speak to whether in fact there will be material repayments during that period. So in effect, we're not really totally boxing out other constituencies without having to draw down the 100 versus 75.
Right. So for the NCTD portion, the 25.5 that's outstanding, that is repaid about 1.2 million per year every September 1st. So over the 10-year period, that's going to bring us another 12 million in capacity. And both on the Mesa and Oceanside will be fully repaid by that time. I think they both have a 5-year. And the Oceanside has already, the clock has already started for them. I think we're in year 2 now for them. So within 5 years, we'll have an additional 5 million. About 10 million actually in capacity, and then another 7 on top of that at the end of 10.
And you mentioned that there was some talk that the county might want to borrow some. Do you have any guesstimate as to what order of magnitude?
I do not. I had a voice note, and I responded in an email, but I was not given a dollar amount.
One more question. What's the spread between what they pay you and what you pay on your paper?
They pay us exactly what we pay. Whatever our expenses are, we pass it through to.
You have no.
There's an admin fee. Right.
Yeah.
Isn't there an admin fee?
Well, I guess there's a remarketing fee to Citibank of 6 basis points. There's the actual 40 basis points that we pay to Union Bank. And then right now the rate is at 175. So you add all those 3 costs, and that's exactly what they pay.
Very nice of you.
We're not in the business to make money. We provide service. That's what we do.
Yeah, so we call those administrative costs.
Right.
Yeah, so we just pass it through.
I have a question for the city. Why don't you guys use this more often with other projects, Akram? I can ask you.
Yeah, and actually, I think you've asked this before, the last time we were here.
Probably.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you know, over the past few years, our cash balance at Sandak had been pretty high. I think at the beginning of FY16, our cash balance was about a little over 55 million. So we wanted to work towards decreasing that cash balance first. Over the past 3 years, we've made significant progress. We've dropped it about 40%, which is a huge undertaking. At the end of this fiscal year, we're estimated to be at about 32 million, which is about 1 fiscal year's worth of our transnet. So we wanted to do that first, and then before asking to borrow additional funds. So that's really the primary reason.
Okay. I guess just there's so many projects with funding that in the city that is not fully there, so it seems like it's an underutilized resource.
So the other thing that we're doing right now in the city is there is a general fund commercial paper program that we're, financial management, debt management, public works is bringing forward to the city council. It'll be approved in the next month or so for about 80 million? Yes. About 80 million. So we're doing our own internal CP program to fund general fund projects that we
Any questions or comments? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Agenda item number 9 is the draft concept for the 2018 annual report.
So In March, ITALC members appointed a subcommittee to work on its annual report. ITALC members Arduino, Halpern, and Chair Fuller were appointed to serve. The annual report subcommittee has met a couple of times since then and provided direction to staff on what should be included in your annual report. We were originally scheduled to bring you a first draft at your June meeting, but subcommittee members felt it would be valuable to bring a conceptual draft and to ask the entire ITALC for input at this point, in addition to bringing back the report in June and July once it's further along in the process. Attachment 1 to your report includes a draft concept of what the report could look like. Based on direction from your subcommittee, the focus of the report contents would highlight your recent performance audit by directly extracting the executive summary from that performance audit report and inserting it here. In addition, the ITALC letter with its recommendations on the 10-year review would be incorporated, as well as highlights from your fiscal year 2017 fiscal audit. We've left the ITALC activities listing and project progress shown as pictures with captions on the pages that follow, in addition to placeholders where the subcommittee is also seeking your input today. And then we recently received additional comments from your subcommittee with a request to include an acknowledgement regarding the transition from financing to pay-as-you-go. So we anticipate adding a special note, and the subcommittee has a meeting later today, so they'll be discussing incorporation of that. And then the schedule has us coming back to your June meeting with a more complete draft, and then final approval at your July meeting before your Chair Fuller, has on his calendar to attend the board meeting July 27th to present the final ITALC annual report at the board. Or to the board. So with that, yeah, today we're seeking additional input.
Just have any additional comments?
I have one simple question. Looking over page 3, or the very first page of the annual report, you included several highlights for our year. Thank
You're
you.
on the cover?
The letter from the ITALC chair.
Yes.
And the last item, the Sandag Plan of Excellence, and 7-point data accuracy and modeling work plan. What was that?
So that's coming to your June meeting.
Yeah.
So it'll be in time to be incorporated in here. So yes, you're right. That's in anticipation of that. Yeah. Some of the items in here are in anticipation of what will still be presented during this fiscal year. So.
Thank you very much.
I had one question, really, just to inform the discussion about what Dick has proposed to include with regard to the pay-as-you-go. It's my understanding that this transition, if you will, is not like a surprise, right? I mean, it had been planned for all along. So could you just remind us the extent to which it's not necessarily, or correct me if I'm wrong, it's not going to necessarily impact projects which already had been planned because, again, this was expected to happen. So if there's any sort of risk or downside to it, would you characterize it more as it does take away a certain degree of flexibility to perhaps initiate any new projects? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, so essentially transitioning from a debt finance program to a pay-as-you-go program. Yes, one of the things that's characterized by that is that your ability to advance dollars to advance more projects is much more limited, right? You're limited to, how much work you can do in a particular year is limited to how much money you get in that particular year. There are some instances where some funds may be able to be advanced, but it's nowhere near as extensive as under a debt finance program. So yeah, flexibility is reduced, but that's something that it's common in this kind of a program, and so we plan for that reduced flexibility. The projects that are currently underway are actually still supported by the debt finance program, like the Mid-Coast project, the South Bay BRT, to some extent the I-5. But as we transition into sort of the next set of projects, the implementation of those will be kind of limited or timed by our ability to secure both formula funds, but also, more importantly, competitive funds.
But it wasn't a surprise necessarily. It was a surprise because Measure A passed. You wouldn't be in this position, right?
Well, it's something
pay as
that,
you go wouldn't be we wouldn't have to explain this.
Right, so essentially what we've
Thing.
informed the board, and we started to do this, I would say, 2, maybe 3 years ago. You know, we said, hey, you know, the program will be transitioning in the next, you know, 5 years or so to a pay-go program, and this is what it means.
Are you,
Measure A, you know, if Measure A had been approved, would have changed that. But without Measure A, the program would have had to change or transition into a pay-as-you-go program. So it's something that we've told the board before, but it's now that it's actually happening, we're now explaining it in a greater level of detail. Okay, this is happening because we are transitioning into a pay-as-you-go program.
so did you give that caveat when you did that to the board 3 years ago, that if Measure A?
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, that was part of the discussions regarding the possibility at that time of moving forward with a new sales tax.
So just one follow-up. At some point, a little bit down the road, we do start, you know, assuming the forecasts come to fruition, we do start generating additional amounts of, let's call it, free cash relative to the planned spending versus the expected increase in tax revenues, right? So would it be the case that, or the view that those increased free cash down the road is not significant enough to then, you know, borrow against, say, you know, 5 years from now, you borrow against the tail amounts of the free cash? Or, you know, is it possible that even if it's, you know, you could advance $100, $200, $300 million, that there might actually be an opening of debt financing, say 5 or so years down the road?
Right. So over the next, I would say the next 5 to 7 years, the amount of money, and we're talking just the Major Corridors program, the amount of money coming into the Major Corridors program from Transnet, the majority of that will be devoted towards debt service. So the amount that's not devoted to debt service will be fairly limited. Beyond that 5 to 7 year period, the amount of money that's not needed for debt service will grow. You know, there may be ups and downs, you know, depending on the economy, but it's expected to grow over time. By then, we're only going to have about, you know, 20 years left in the measure. So yeah, you could still borrow, but it's not going to be as long of a term borrowing. What we would probably do is just to help us manage cash flow needs or you know, periods of time where there's an opportunity to do some you know, additional projects with that additional capacity, borrowing capacity, is perhaps tap more into a commercial paper program type of thing where you're kind of filling in the holes in terms of your cash flow needs with that short-term borrowing. But longer-term borrowing, unless there's an additional extension approved by voters, you know, the number of years left in the program is just going to be slowly shrinking, and so it's almost like managing a short-term borrowing program.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I know we do have a subcommittee meeting after this to go over this.
We pulled some stuff that didn't seem relevant to what ITALC does, and so that's kind of some of the things where we said we wanted to do links instead of putting certain things in here. And I think we are changing some of the graphs or pulling in an old graph from a previous report, but we wanted to make it as relevant to what ITALC does as possible versus just what Sandag does. Dick didn't write any comments on this one?
No, well, he did, that's
okay.
he wants to highlight this issue of the transition to pay-go, so that was his suggestion.
No other comments on that, we'll move on to item number 10. This is the project cost estimating process with Jim. Good morning.
Good morning. Before we get into this item, I just want to comment on the chair's thing about Facebook. And we do have a way bigger presence And my favorite is not our Facebook page, but our Instagram page.
I'm not on Instagram yet.
If you follow Sandag on Instagram, you get to see a lot of really, really cool construction photos of all the stuff we're doing out there. So, and this is how my kids figure out what we do, what I do on any given day. So, okay, so cost estimating. You know, every year our board goes off-site for a retreat. And at the retreat a couple months ago, we did a series of lightning rounds where we went over, you know, just in like 15 minutes or so, the regional transportation plan, our service bureau projects, things like that. And one of these tables that the board members rotated to was on cost estimating for capital projects. And so Alan and I presented this, and our transportation committee chair, Mayor Desmond, he wanted us to bring it back to the transportation committee, ITOC, and the board of directors with a little bit more expanded explanation of what goes into estimating costs on capital projects. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so Alan's going to talk about how we estimate costs on projects and some of the challenges and risks we face. And then I'm going to talk about how we manage those risks and communicate them and communicate the status and the risk management and all that to you all, to the elected officials, and the public in general. So, turn it over to Alan.
Good morning. I'm Alan Costa with Caltrans. I'm the I-5 Corridor Director. One of the things that we kind of started with the board is just reminding the board that when we talk about a cost estimate, it's really 6 individual cost estimates. It has unique methodologies that we sort of roll together, and then we present an aggregate number per project. But going into a project estimate includes a construction cost. A construction cost would include the labor, the materials, the equipment needed to actually build the project. You know, typically, depending on the project, that's 50 to 70% of the overall project cost. The project also includes the utilities and the right-of-way acquisition, especially early on in the project. Obviously, the underground utilities can be difficult to estimate. Also factored into this is ultimately the cost to the project is an outcome of reviewing the contractual agreements that the agencies have that sort of discuss liability. So it's kind of a lower level of estimating that goes into it. When we talk about project costs, also includes your environmental mitigation costs, which can be your sound walls, it can be your habitat, construction of habitat, preservation of habitat. And these are almost like little individual projects. You know, they have their own challenges in terms of negotiating right-of-way, sustainability of landscape, trying to get the landscape to work given seasonal variations. All those are challenges in terms of developing the project, keeping it within the budget. The professional services is essentially staff time, either the Caltrans staff, Sandag staff, and then consultant services needed to deliver the project. And then finally, the risk and contingency. And Jim will talk later on about how we assess the risk of a project, and the contingency is then developed as a way of offsetting at least a portion of those. So one of the key challenges that we have with estimating is, you know, we get, it's easier to estimate the project as additional information comes on board. When you're in the very initial phases of the project, you have not a whole lot of information, especially when you're in the planning phase. In the planning phase, typically you haven't had an opportunity to reach out to the stakeholders, to the resource agencies, to the public, and so the project is very conceptual then. Typically at that point in time, because we don't have a lot of that information, we use historical rules of thumb to estimate the project, such as dollars per mile. And then as we enter into the project development phase, in the environmental phase, that's when we first have an opportunity to start, you know, the scope starts coming into view. We may have alternatives. We may have a range of alternatives. So by the time you get to the environmental process, through the environmental process, you then have some additional certainty because you've selected a preferred alternative. But you still haven't done your final design until that last phase. And that final design, that's where you start understanding the constructability. How many hours will I have on the freeway project to be able to get in there on a given day? Can the contractor get in for 10 hours, 8 hours, or 6 hours? Those things all affect the finished price of the project. What's the geotechnical like? At that point in time, final design, we start doing our log of test drilling. As an example, on I-5, the original bridge that you see out there in Cardiff, the foundations are about 80, 90 feet deep. The new columns, after we did the geotechnical, were at about 240 feet deep. So you can imagine at the planning level, we sort of assumed replacing in kind. By the time we got through design, and given today's seismic requirements and all that, it didn't quite work for us. And so those are a lot of the challenges that we go through. Just back up a little bit. By the time we get through the environmental process, we're at about 50% of the items. We know what the scope is. Your bridge, your pavement, we're estimating those pretty tightly, but the other 50% is still rules of thumb, historical rules of thumb. And again, it's not till you get into the design and the job gets closer to construction that you're sort of locked in. This can be particularly challenging when you realize that those three boxes can represent a 30 or 40-year period from when a project is first initiated and put into the RTP to actually when we actually break ground on a project. Just given where the project is, priorities, funding levels, we've seen projects take 30 years. And so when you're estimating a project, one of the biggest challenges is the external pressures over those 30 years and changes in public policy, such as air quality requirements on construction equipment, water quality requirements, just the availability of aggregate in San Diego, where we were getting aggregate 30 years ago is completely different than where we're getting it today, and those all affect prices. And Jim will talk a little bit more about that. I know this is sort of a difficult matrix to see, but essentially what this is we went and looked at industry standard. Do all states, do everyone estimating these long lead projects have similar challenges? And this came from the American Society of Cost Estimators. And when they look at cost estimates, they sort of rank them between a 0, meaning a job that's either at construction, going into construction. So you got a lot of information, a lot of detail, all the way to a 5, where a 5 is like a planning estimate, and those historical rules of thumb. What's interesting is on their matrix, when you look over at the far right, the sort of the typical accuracy that they see with these estimates. Number 5, your planning estimate, typically has a range of 150%. By the time you get it into final design, you're looking at a 15 to 20% range. So I think, intuitively that sort of makes sense. It points us towards, expressing those early costs and ranges instead of expressing them as points, because I think the perception is sometimes that we're providing a very precise number, but there's an inherent sort of gray fuzziness in there for all those reasons that we talked about. So I think it's good to look outside and see how other people and they all fight the same challenges. So with that, I'll transition to Jim, who's going to talk about the industry trends that are out there and how we manage them. The industry trends that are out there.
Thanks, Alan. So a lot of thought goes into how we estimate these costs. Hopefully you can see that. One of the biggest drivers of cost recently, though, has been construction escalation, basically inflation on a construction job. Here's the Caltrans Construction Cost Index. So this is they gather information from all their projects statewide, and they come up with this overall index, and they pegged 2007 as 100, arbitrary, but that's 100. You can see that all through the 90s into the 2000s, it was fairly predictable. Generally always on the increase, but fairly predictable. Then in the early 2000s, 2003 up until about 2008, huge increase in cost. And then as soon as the Great Recession hit, a very large drop. And then we've returned to some level of normalcy in the 2010, 11, 12 time frame. So, and that stops at 2013. And so if we were predicting costs in 2012 or 13 and trying to figure out, okay, well, where's it going to go in 2016? So we're bidding a job, let's say 3 years in the future, and we're trying to figure it out. You could go a number of different ways, excuse me. So there's the orange line there. You could just say, okay, it's the middle of the road. And that is statistically, that's calculated, right? That line is a 50% confidence level. So we would have about a 50% chance of our cost estimate in 2016 being a little, being above that line or below that line. It's also, coincidentally, it sort of looks like it's a return to where we have been historically. So you could go that way. Or you could say, look, there's a lot of volatility out there. Let's go from a 50% confidence level to a 95% confidence level. So using that confidence level, here's the lower boundary, and here's the upper boundary. And the reason that is so wide is because you have to look at what's happened in the recent past. So to get that confidence going forward, you have to look that way. Well, it didn't really end up that way. Here's how it ended up. So if you were a project manager predicting in 2013 a job that was going to bid in 2016, here's what it ended up looking like. And this is real data. So the blue line is real data. This stops at 2016, but I can tell you that in 2017 it continued going up, and it didn't start going down again until the very last quarter of 2017. Now, a project manager doesn't try to figure that out because we update things on an annual basis. So we know where this is headed. But what it demonstrates is, right now, historically this is not a risk, but right now this is a big risk to how we estimate projects. So big risks, we have lots and lots of risks on any capital project. So, so what do we do about it? I mean, that's the most important thing is what do? We have a significant risk. Well, we manage it because we manage this and we manage all sorts of other risks. We talked about we're transitioning to a pay-as-you-go basis. When you have risks like this on a program level, that's one of the things you can do. If you can't, you can push projects out and wait for the revenues to catch up. And so but as you go to a more pay-as-you-go basis, that becomes less and less of an opportunity. An example of where we did do that was on our South Bay Rapid corridor. That corridor is sort of flying under the radar compared to what we're doing with Mid-Coast and North Coast corridor. But that's a $128 million corridor that will take a rapid bus network from the international border at Otay Mesa up through Chula Vista on an exclusive guideway, then up 805 and into downtown San Diego. That's set to open for service next winter. But originally, that's 4 construction jobs. And originally, those 4 construction jobs were going to be staged, so they all opened at the same time. Makes sense, right? But as cash got short, because we were bidding these jobs in this time frame, as cash got short and we saw costs going up, a mitigation was, we then staggered them. We worked with MTS and the City of Chula Vista to prioritize of those 4 construction projects, which are the most important ones that get done. And we then restage them to award the contracts in a priority order to make sure that we had enough money to do the next priority one, before we had enough money to do the current one before we awarded the lower priority construction contract. Luckily, we haven't been in this situation all that often because we've also been very competitive in getting additional funds from different funding agencies. And so new sources of money, we've been very successful in this region. Okay, so we talked about pay-as-you-go. So if that is more limited opportunity in the near future, so what else can we do to mitigate? The Board of Directors created, in this current fiscal year for the first time, a capital program reserve. And that's $54 million. And that reserve is completely under control of the Board of Directors, and it can be used for something like a right-of-way issue that's unexpected, a construction claim that needs to be paid. It's things like that where if we need an infusion of cash in order to solve a particular problem, that's how that risk is mitigated. Okay, so that's costs on a program level. Pushing jobs out, the capital program reserve, $54 million. But the majority of our risks are at a project level. And if you look on the attachment to your item, it's called, it's attachment 1, it's called Project Cost Estimating, Risks, Phases, Risks, and Best Practices. You can see at the bottom of that page, There's typical risks for projects. And that's a nice list. Far, far from complete, but that's a nice list. You see that the first one listed on there is market volatility. Once again, this is a major risk now, but historically it has not been. But we're managing it. Look at the second list on there: legislative and policy changes. Right? Alan talked about that. Stormwater. That was a legislative and policy decision that says we're going to be, as a region, as a state, much more robust in how we manage stormwater on construction jobs, and stormwater as cities and operators, whether not you're a railroad or a freeway, how they manage stormwater. This greatly added to the cost of our capital projects, just like it did with all of our member agencies. It did. And so that's a major policy type legislative risk. Another example that you probably haven't heard about is just a couple of years ago, the federal government made a determination that says for all commuter rail stations, the goal is to have level boarding. Great concept, but it comes with a price tag. And so whenever we touch a platform now on the Costa or Amtrak, we have to raise it to provide for level boarding, at least for Amtrak trains, because unfortunately each train has a little different elevation to get in, so you can't provide it for all, so you provide it for the lowest boarding train, which is Amtrak. That increased the cost a pretty good amount for our Oceanside Transit Center project that we completed last November, and to the Poinsettia Coaster Station project that we just broke ground on a couple of weeks ago. Once again, it was a policy change. You see, right-of-way escalation is listed on that list as a risk. We all know that property is going through the roof. Property prices are going through the roof. So how do we mitigate something like that? Well, if we have an opportunity to build a small retaining wall to save from having to take a sliver of land, buy a sliver of land, it may be cheaper to build that small retaining wall now, where in past years it wasn't. It was way cheaper to buy the little sliver of land. Those are the types of things we do. And I mentioned the Poinsettia project. Because costs are going up, one of the things we've done in the Poinsettia project, we anticipate, well, we didn't know where we were going to be on this curve, even when we advertised the project. And so that's a risk. And so we took the most critical parts of the Poinsettia project, and we said, that's your base bid. And then we had our construction contractors, our bidders, bid alternative bids for added elements. And depending on how their bids came in, we could either award those added elements or not. Bids came in higher than anticipated, so we did not award those added elements. That's called alternative bid, and that's another way we use to manage the risk of cost escalation and costs in general on a construction job. Okay, well, let me back up here. You know, costs don't always go up though, because look at this, costs went down. And you may remember, we did a lot of work during this period of time. And in fact, it was during this period of time that we were building the I-15 managed lanes, a $1.4 billion corridor set of improvements. The board used the savings, where'd my cursor go? The savings during this period of time from the I-15 corridor to rebuild the Nordall Road Bridge. Incredible improvement that was needed up on Route 78. So that's where the savings can go. Also during this time, we were bidding the trolley renewal corridor, which is, you had a 35-year-old trolley corridor, the oldest parts of the blue line and the orange line. They need to be upgraded to a state of good repair. But for these price decreases, we could not have done anywhere near as much work rehabbing that existing old system as we do now. Rehabbing that existing old system had some ancillary benefits. It made us much more competitive to get mid-coast dollars to build a new part of the system. People are always concerned, are you sacrificing the old stuff to build the new glitzy stuff? So we took advantage of that for trolley renewal and I-15 and a number of other projects. We were talking about the chair's plan of excellence. This is one thing that's in that plan of excellence is how do we manage costs on construction projects? So how do we manage the risk? So we've got all these risks and we have all these techniques. How do we do that? How do we capture all that? Here's just a screenshot of how we're doing it on the Mid-Coast project, right? The biggest thing we've ever done. It's what we call a risk matrix. And this is just a screenshot of a very, very long document. It lists each risk, it lists some proposed actions and the responsible party, who's managing that risk. But here's what the meat of it looks like. It's the box in the upper right-hand corner. So we take every risk and we say, okay, what's the cost impact of that risk? What's the schedule impact of that risk? And then we multiply it times what's the probability of that risk happening? And then that gives us a priority of either a high, medium, or low risk. Obviously, we deal with the high risks first. And you brainstorm how you're going to mitigate that risk, even better, how you're going to avoid that risk. Because we started doing this right at the beginning of the project. You avoid the risk, you avoid the cost. We also do things like on the biggest projects, like Midcoast, on really mega projects, we do things like we do peer reviews. Midcoast had a peer review on its cost and schedule. We share best practices with local agencies. We're very active in something called the Regional Construction Procurement Committee, where in fact, I think, Brad, aren't you still on the Regional Construction Procurement Committee? Yeah, where we share best practices. They come up with great ideas of how you mitigate things like that, how you predict it, how you estimate costs, and also best practices on engineering details. We develop nomographs and things like that, looking back at historical data. This is just for Sandag projects. This is just our in-house stuff. We track all of our costs with historical norms compared to our sister agencies across the country. So there's lots and lots of ways to do this. Okay, so we have all this information. We have these risks. They're being managed. How do we communicate this to you all? How do we to the elected officials and also to the public? And this is also another element of the chair's plan of excellence. So something we're going to be doing new is Jose and his staff are putting together various metrics on the health of not just the project, but the overall program, the capital program. And we're going to start reporting that to the board starting this summer. So that's something new. Corridor status reports. We're reinvigorating those where we have our major corridors like Allen on North Coast Corridor, John Haggerty. You may remember he's been here before talking about Midcoast, where we're going to give you the project status, not only our project and statusing of the project, but what's even more important is we want to share with you all some of the risks that lie ahead and some of the challenges we have in these projects, because that's what you can deal with. So this is not just about successes. We continue to bring you quarterly status reports on all the capital projects. You had one on consent this morning. We have our Transnet dashboard, which is updated monthly. You can see that online. And then there's the annual Transnet progress report that is prepared for ITOC that we also share with our Transportation Committee and our Board of Directors. So just to summarize, what Alan was talking about, at different stages of project development, we have different ranges of costs. At certain times, we actually have to pick a number, right? You can't plug a range into some of the formulas we do, so we have to pick a number. But we want to communicate these better that said this is really a range so that everyone knows the cost certainty that we have going in. Currently, market volatility is one of the biggest risks we have going on estimating our project costs. And finally, there are different techniques to manage and to communicate those cost estimates. So we want to do a better job at doing that to make sure everybody knows where we are in this very, very large capital program. So with that, I'd like to wrap that up and answer any questions you might have.
Do you have any questions or comments?
It's tough business.
Yes. Any questions or comments?
It's tough business.
Yes. Any questions or comments?
Well, I got to tell you, between Alan and Jim, you guys do a great job communicating the issue clearly. I think Mike Manis, we listened to your report to the board last week, and the aggregate shortage is a big, big issue for the industry, and you hit that on the nose. The air quality and stormwater, I mean, all these projects now have to contain the water, so you have to build big containers for the stormwater. So all these construction costs are just incredible. The policy changes, I think labor issues, I think going forward, I think with the board structure here, the Sandag board could affect labor issues. And so I'm curious I know you're sort of planning on Ramon in your office is talking to to us about the skilled workforce issues and how that can impact the cost of construction. So I think that's going to be important. And then the industry is meeting with you quarterly with Ramon and your staff. I think that's important to keep track of how the costs are going up and down. But I commend you guys. You do a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I didn't mention is we meet on a quarterly basis with our AGC contractors, so we meet with our construction contractor group. We also meet with our the consultant designers. And I think one of the beauties of the project delivery model we have is when you can combine in-house staff that has great depth of experience in delivering projects in this region, on these highways or on these rail corridors, a lot of depth of experience, and you combine them with consultants that have a great breadth of experience across the state, across the country, you get a really good mix there where you can maximize the benefits of both teams. You can see how others do it. You combine that with the expertise of what is actually out there now. So people that know that the current columns on I-5 that was built in the 1960s are 80 feet deep.
Jim, just a question with the projects that you have, Sandag has coming up, mostly at this point, are not, besides the Mid-Coast and the Caltrans as the I-5, you don't have many big projects in coming forward besides bike paths. I mean, in the immediate future, maybe the next couple of years, unless you see an infusion of dollars. With all this cost estimate and all that, I mean, are you all, what's the game plan for these larger projects with this? Because at this point, you don't have a whole lot of projects. I mean,
No.
the regional plan, I guess, I haven't followed what major projects are coming, but you've had some serious projects. In the near future, you don't have this coming.
Right. Right now, we are in the biggest construction program we've ever had, easily. And we've been very successful competing for SB 1 dollars. And so Alan just got $195 million for North Coast Corridor for the freeway. We're very competitive on the rail projects also, and so we've received money for the future design of a lot of those projects. And so, assuming SB 1 is not repealed, we would anticipate being very competitive for construction dollars also.
But as far as the major type projects coming up in the regional plan, I can't recollect what the projects, some more widening mitigation projects. Do you have a lot of projects, if all goes well, coming forward that you're going to really rely on all this issue?
I mean, I have a couple things. One is the STIP hasn't had an opportunity to have some new starts, at least on the highway, for quite a few years, right? In last STIP, we had 4 new starts. And so they're sort of the next up-and-coming projects, things like 1578, 94, 125. So they're in the hopper, assuming SB 1 doesn't get repealed. So they're starting to move forward. The other thing I like about this conversation, I think the timing is good because it's sort of prefacing the RTP. Because I think it's this cost estimating uncertainty sometimes undermines our credibility, right? Because over those 30 years, as the RTPs get updated and the costs change, as some folks thought of them as budgets and very specific numbers, that volatility sort of, again, undermined our credibility. So I think it's good to remind everyone what goes into cost estimating so that they all look at them at an appropriate level.
And I just wanted to add to that. So the good news on the $195 million of SB 1 funds for I-5, essentially what that does is it frees up that same amount of regional funds that would need to go to the project if we hadn't been successful in securing those dollars. And so those dollars, we took an item to the Transportation Committee in April to say, if SB 1 is not repealed, then these dollars that would have been needed for the I-5 that are now essentially freed up could support the environmental and the design effort for a number of corridors around the region. And these are like Highway 78, 805, 15, some great separations in Chula Vista. So there's, a number of possibilities, but right now, between now and November, it remains at risk. And so until we know the outcome of the vote, we wouldn't recommend doing any kind of budget amendments to start on this work, because if it's repealed, then the money will go away. Repealed.
I don't think people realize the importance of SB 1. It is amazing. More and more cities and are putting press releases out saying that they really need this SB 1 because if it doesn't, there's some struggles ahead, I guess. So, thank you.
I had a couple of questions and a comment. First a comment. You know, as a committee, we've been talking a lot about digestibility of the large amounts of information we and I guess the various Sandag board members get as well. I just want to say that, you know, thank you. That estimate classification matrix, I think, really does a fabulous job of taking a lot of moving parts and putting it in a very coherent and easily digestible fashion. So I thought that was great. Two questions I had, Jim. You'd mentioned in your last points here about the concept of the range of costs, and you have to pick a number. And I'm curious who picks the number. It seems to me that picking the number really has built into it a position on what degree, where you want to be in that risk spectrum. And I'm just curious, do you get guidance from the board as to where the board wants to be on the risk spectrum, or who kind of picks the number?
Yeah, you know, let's take the plan of finance we do for Transnet every year. So we have economists, Jim Miller and Ray Major, who give us guidance. We track other indices, and those indices go into what we assume are going to be a rate of increase of Transnet revenues and a rate of increase of construction costs. And that works into the plan of finance. And so that guidance that we get is then given to the board of directors to weigh in on. Jose, do you want to expand on that at all?
I think that's a really good question in the sense that typically what we use is we use the last best number that we have, understanding that there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that number. And so depending on how our economists see the future, manifesting itself, we apply whatever escalation factors or whatever to that one number. But what we haven't done a very good job on is to explain that there's uncertainty associated with that number. It's not a point, precise exact estimate. So what we need to do a better job on is to say, okay, this is more of an estimate for planning purposes, but really there's, it could be, like Alan was saying, it could be 150% wide range if you're just getting started in the planning process for a particular cost estimate. So that's one of the things that we need to do a better job on in terms of explaining what's behind that cost estimate. If you're in the planning phase, then there's a wide, potentially wide, range where that cost estimate will eventually land. If you're in the construction, just approaching, being able to advertise the project for construction, your range is going to be much tighter in terms of your confidence level of, knowing what that ultimate cost is going to be.
When you say we need to do a better job, are you talking about the staff's communication to the
Yes,
board?
for example, if you look at our regional plan,
right.
There's I don't know, 5, 6 dozen projects that are listed in there, and each one has a cost estimate associated with it. But a number of those projects are in the planning phase. The level of work that's been done to develop that estimate is very high level. Other projects are maybe in the environmental phase or in the design phase, but all of them are listed in sort of the same degree of certainty. And so we need to show those cost estimates and say, okay, this one is more certain, but this one is less certain.
Just add a couple points too is from an engineer's perspective, right? They develop these estimates always in today's costs. And so the project risk that Jim was talking about, those are things that we expect the team to sort of develop probabilities and assign costs and handle it that way in the project estimate. But those external pressures, those market volatility, we really let the whole program drive what percentages does the region want to use looking forward, because you don't really want the engineers picking and choosing on a project basis, right? And the same thing would be true, because you get this wide variety of numbers, and it really is more of a programmatic decision than a project decision. And the same is sort of true when you're developing planning estimates. You don't really want all your teams to be very conservative, because you're going to suck out all the money that they're not all going to come in at 150. You're going to get a range there, and we're hoping that when you look at a portfolio of projects, you're still hitting a good average. But one might be minus 150, one might be plus 150. So you try to encourage the engineers to sort of hit in the middle, and then try to make the more programmatic decision.
One of the things, I think this illustrates really well that some of us have talked about before, when there was so much attention by the public and politicians on the revenue forecast for Transnet, and some of us, I know myself included, said, it's like I wish the same focus on it. There's much more volatility in two things we've talked about here: the estimating, or what the project's going to cost over time, and what the SB1 or the funding sources. Those two things are much grander scale of potential change over time than this revenue forecast of Transnet, sales tax. But we seem to all, what it's caused. But it's a huge focus on something that was like not the biggest elephant in the room, and so I kind of wish this type of thing to educate and show to the board and different the public and agencies somehow to disseminate that to see that there's no way to be perfect with estimating these. Like that project the city brought in earlier today, that bridge project. 20 years ago, that concept, they was going to widen the bridge, and it was like $20 million project potentially. They took them 20 years through environmental and different things, and they found out that the bridges existing are on timber piles in the river, so they can't widen them on these old timber foundations. So things change, and you can't predict what regulations change, and all these things. They really have a lot of volatility on this, and then obviously like the funding could be there today, could be repealed next year. The governor, I was having lunch with the governor yesterday in Sacramento, and he's pushing hard for retaining the Prop 1B stuff, but he's basically saying, if this goes away, we're back to the drawing board. It could be 10 years before we find another funding source. It's just, that volatility is much greater than trying to estimate sales tax.
What I think when we've been able to break it down into real life examples, people get it, right? So part of estimating is, what's the price of gasoline going to be 4 years from now?
Right.
Right. Most people would say, I don't know. Well, but things like that are a major driver, obviously, to the construction estimate. The steel tariff issue, right? That's something that none of us can estimate. It's going to take a while for us to sort of work our way through. What does that mean? Increase, decrease? Depends who you talk to. You get all different varieties of flavor of how that's going to impact. We've got a lot of work, obviously, in Los Angeles with the Olympics coming up, and we've got their measure program. So competition, we're probably going to get less contract. So all these things are working together. They're kind of layered.
Yeah.
So if I could, the other question I had, and thanks, that's very helpful. If you go back to that construction cost curve, I was curious if there are any particular noteworthy underlying factors that we've been able to break out of the data that explain the surprisingly sharp increase in the upward slope of that curve, and to what extent any of them may be thought of or reasonably thought of as perhaps short-term in nature, as opposed to we're seeing it like a new potential long-term trend.
Yes, let me see. Michael, can you go back to one of those?
I think it's slide 9.
Yeah.
There you go, that one, okay. So I think most economists would say this is not sustainable. And something else that I've been told from economists before, over the long haul, costs will generally go up, revenues will generally go up more. When you look at Transnet 1 from 87 to 2007, that's generally what happened. So costs went up, revenues went up more, and I'm going to play amateur economist here. If it didn't do that over the long haul, you wouldn't have a growing economy. Generally, we have a growing economy. Generally, paraphrase that right? And so that's not sustainable. If you want to know cost, I think Alan hit on it. I think you have a booming private sector and you have a booming public sector at the same time. And so there is a much greater demand for the services. And I think that's on the grander scale. I see Brad as he acknowledging that. On the local scale, we touched on some of those work windows. You don't close down a lane on I-15 to do work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon like you did 20 years ago. And so therefore, we're doing a lot of work at night on the railroad and on the freeway system. You get a shorter work window, you get much less efficient workers, and it costs more. It just flat out costs more. If you have to pour concrete at 2 a.m., it costs more. And so you've got competition, you've got an increasingly urbanized area that shortens your work windows. We talked about material sites. It wasn't that many years ago when the vast majority of our material sites, our aggregates for concrete and aggregate-based things like that, came from Mission Valley. Now those are all condos, or shopping centers, and apartment buildings. Hazard Center is a great example. It used to be the Brickyard. And so you do things like, you factor all those smaller things in, and you're going to have increasing costs. Some of it's due to the urbanization of this area, the maturity of this area. Others are just flat out market forces.
Let me give you an example of structures concrete. So this list is Caltrans index, as Jim said, it's 8 specific items that we track. One of them is structures concrete. And when you were looking at something like the 805 South or 805 North, the Carroll Canyon job that we built 4, 5, 6 years ago, we were spending about $400 a yard, $500 a yard for structures concrete. Both Mid-Coast and I-5 are paying close to $1,000 a yard, over $1,000 a yard. And just a lot of different things went into that. You know, the materials, but also everyone's changing their mix design because of GHG issues. And there's a prevailing wage now on the drivers. Communities are asking for more aesthetics, and so it's just more difficult to to form some of this stuff. So all these things are just sort of very additive, and when there's building work and all that stuff going on, that's again a competition to some of this stuff, which is sort of difficult to do. And so, given their preference, they're probably going to go work on a building job. They're not necessarily going to give me a good bid to work in the middle of I-5. So it's really hard to parse all those things that I just listed to understand why it went from 400 to 1,000 or where it's going from here.
Okay, on to item number 11, the draft 2018 Regional Transportation Improvement Program. Proposed project listing. Good morning.
So SAMDAG, as the region's metropolitan planning organization, is required by state and federal law to develop and adopt the Regional Transportation Improvement Program of the RTIP, which is a multi-year program of proposed major transportation projects, including the Transnet program of projects. Today we're presenting the preliminary draft listing of the proposed 5-year Transnet program of projects for the 2018 RTIP, which includes fiscal years 2019 through 23. And included in your agenda item today is the information about the 2018 RTIP and the upcoming schedule. Based on comments received at the ITAC's review of the 2016 draft RTIP, attachment 1 beginning on page 3 provides a listing of the 12 new projects funded with Transnet funds, which are proposed to be programmed in the 2018 RTIP. Attachment 1A, beginning on page 11, provides a listing of all of the Transnet funded projects. Resolutions are due to SAMDAG by June 29, 2018 for local agency Transnet funded projects. For SAMDAG and Caltrans projects, project changes are dependent on approval of the FY19 Sandag program budget, which is scheduled to be approved on May 25th. Attachment 2, beginning on page 127, is a program summary of major projects by mode. This table breaks up all the projects into the RTIP into specific modes, which is dependent on the type of work being done, as well as shows a breakdown by funding type: federal, state transnet, and local private funds. There are currently 7 different modes listed. The first mode is major multimodal facilities, which includes projects along major highways that include HOV connectors and direct access ramps. The border access port mode includes projects such as the 905 freeway, connectors to State Route 125 and State Route 11 projects. And other highway under the major highway mode includes the remaining work on projects that are open to traffic, including State Route 52 and the I-15 HOV links. So that's a summary of all of the projects that are programmed. So it's showing $14.2 billion for the whole program. Attachment 3 in your backup shows on page 128, provides the cumulative capacity analysis of revenue versus programmed for Transnet Local Street Improvement or LSI funds for the draft 2018 RTIP for all of our local agencies. This item is presented today for your review or discussion. The entire draft 2018 RTIP, including its air quality conformity analysis and draft air quality conformity redetermination of the San Diego Forward the Regional Plan, will be presented to you at your July 13th meeting for your review and discussion. Final 2018 RTIP will be presented for discussion, and an additional opportunity for comments will be available in September. Pending the Transportation Committee's recommendation, the Board of Directors will be requested to adopt the final 2018 RTIP and make its air quality conformity determination at its September 28, 2018 meeting. This is due to the state by October 1st. So that's the layout for the RTIP, and just see if there's any questions or discussions about any particular projects or the.
So on attachment 2, major multimodal facilities, major transit, major highways. So there are, Jim just talked about these sort of the estimates on these projects. What are those projects in general on like Interstate 5 and then multimodal, and then major highway projects?
So the multimodal projects include projects that have HOV lanes and direct access ramps and making, what else did I have? I think it's just mostly the connectors then on those projects.
So ongoing projects related to the North Coast corridor, for instance?
Those would be in the I-5.
I-5, for instance,
Yeah.
And then on the those numbers that are listed, Transnet 242 million. And now is that all based on the cost of just what they just talked about, sort of the
This is what's programmed, so yeah, it should be based on the current.
And how long are these projects going on, for instance?
Well, remember, some of these dollars are actually prior.
Yeah, would include the prior dollars on
So
projects
some of
that
these,
are.
especially like on the I-805 corridor, most of the work here is, we're essentially finishing up those projects, and so most of those dollars and expenditures are behind us. But for the I-5, this would represent the dollars of the ongoing work, so like what's currently under construction. It would not include some of the SB1 dollars that have just recently been identified because they haven't been added to it yet.
Right. When we bring back the draft in July, those dollars will be added. You'll see a difference. So it'll be more like $15 million. 15 billion. I'm sorry. The total program.
Mr. Chair, I have three very brief comments, not questions.
Okay.
First of all, over my 7 years on this committee, I've grown to love this document. And I'm serious. This is a roadmap of where all this money is going. And I don't read it every night, but if you have any question about any project, you can look in here and look it up and see what's happening with the money that we're raising and spending. That's point number one. Point number two, the first attachment is a list of new projects, which is only 8 pages. And it's much easier just to glance through that and see what the changes are to what you've been looking at all this time. And point number 3, I really like the new project by the City of Santee, which is called Pavement Condition Report. They're spending $70,000, the way I interpret this, to try to go out and study their city pavement conditions. So we will know what, they'll be able to report on what progress they're making. And we've been pushing all cities, all member agencies to do this kind of studies. So those are my 3 comments. I wanted to invite your attention to them all, to my comments, based upon, again, my 7 years on this in this organization. Thank you.
I'm glad you like it. That makes me happy.
Any comments?
I've had the experience to read these as well.
So I've a question on table 3. I just want to make sure I'm actually understanding. Footnote 5, in reference to City of Mesa, revenue does not include reduction for commercial paper repayments. So does that mean that to the extent that they're repaying principal or principal and interest on commercial paper, the revenue numbers show does not include those payments, whether it's principal or interest?
Because when the revenue was estimated for the agencies in February, they hadn't had their commercial paper approved yet, and so it wasn't shown as a reduction to their revenue, but their programming is anticipating that reduction, and that's why it looks like they're under-programmed. So that's what that comment means, that they're borrowing the money, and they'll and that'll come out of their revenue in the future when we do the estimate next year.
Okay, so but the revenue numbers that we're seeing here include amounts that actually will be used for commercial paper payments?
Yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Sue? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item number 12, Andre, the financial markets overview. And Jim too.
Good morning. So on a quarterly basis, we bring to you all the review of developments in the financial markets, and kind of give you an update of our debt portfolio, what's going on there. And typically Ray Majors with me, he wasn't able to be here, so today we have Jim Miller, our senior economist, will kind of give you highlights of what's going on in the local economy and the big picture. So I'll have Jim kick it off initially.
Okay. Yeah, you can see here some data points for you to look at. In the upper left, we have Dow Industrials, which had a really good, about 14-month run until January when they dropped down below. But it really, even with that 8.5% drop we've had since January, we're still about 16% up year over year, which is pretty healthy, taking some of the froth out of the markets. The 10-year Treasury on the upper right, you can see, is up to 2.95%. They're at annual highs, indicating that interest rates are going up. These are expectations. Lower left, the federal funds rate has gone up 0.75% since last year, and we're expecting about 2 to 3 more raises by the Fed this year in the federal funds rate. Basically because inflation is starting to hit their target 2%. This is for the month of March 2018 and the month of March 2017, we had 2.4% growth in both those months in inflation. It's about 2% overall year over year. So that's the Fed's target rate, and they're raising interest rates to account for that. San Diego specifically, you can see unemployment in San Diego is down to really, really low, 3.2%. That's down percent from last year. We've added about 24,000 jobs. And we're really reaching kind of full employment, as are California and the U.S. In fact, the U.S. number there is 4.1%. The jobs report that just came out last Friday for the U.S. Was down to 3.9% again. So we're seeing some very, very low unemployment rates. We're also here in San Diego seeing good venture capital attraction and good business formation. So those are all very positive things. And when business formation and capital attraction this low, this good, you would expect wages to be rising, but actually quarter over quarter we've actually seen some decrease in real wages here in San Diego. And these are real wages adjusted for inflation. And one of the reasons that we're seeing wages, real wages declining a little bit in San Diego, nationally they've gone up about 2.6%, is inflation is driven by housing prices. You can see down there in the lower left quadrant, up 8.7%. Rental prices are probably up even more than that. So the cost of living here in San Diego is really difficult. We talked about construction costs a couple of items ago. We are still down in construction employment in the San Diego region, still down about 15% from our 06 peak in construction employment. And we're building about 10,000 new housing units in San Diego year over year the last 3 years, which is a substantial improvement from what we saw during the Great Recession, but nowhere near what we were seeing before then, and really not enough to meet the demand of increased population here in San Diego. We need about 12,000 units a year just to keep up with demand. We'll need a lot more than that if we want to start kind of digging our way out of the housing crisis that we're entering. Taxable retail sales, quarter 4 2017 was about 3.3% over quarter 4 2016. Overall, over the last 4 quarters, we've grown about 4.1% in retail sales, which is pretty healthy. It's beating statewide numbers. Construction and transportation were both big risers in that. General retail, as we've seen over the last few years, is lagging a little. You know, the competition with Amazon versus brick and mortar has hurt us. Consumer preferences for less taxed items is a long-term concern. And when I do presentations like this, I'm often asked, well, the things are really rosy right now. When is the party going to? When are the good times going to stop rolling? Most forecasts I've seen have continued to push back their recession scenarios a couple of years now. We're into most of the forecasts have recessions not until 2020. You know, I think the first recession scenario back in 2012, I started seeing people assuming recessions would come in 2014, so we keep pushing that back. Recessions don't die of old age, by the way, or expansions don't die of old age. You know, something triggers them. It could be, you know, malfeasance in the financial markets. It could be something like the trade war or energy price shock. All of those things are obviously threats. But generally speaking, people are pretty confident, people being economists, I don't know if it actually qualifies people, tend to be pretty calm right now despite some of the political instability we've seen going forward. So our contractor that we work with most closely on looking at taxable retail sales doesn't have a recession scenario until late 2020. So we're hoping that we can last at least that long.
So that thing says that wages, the average wage is over $50,000 a year?
That is the median wage in San Diego is about $55,000 a year.
$55,000 a year.
And 2 people earning that wage cannot afford a median home in San Diego.
Wow. Thank you.
And just unbundling the decrease in real wages, is that partly relating to the new job growth in unskilled versus skilled labor, or is it the case that even in skilled labor jobs, people are just not getting increases, or could you comment a little bit?
It's more the former. We actually took a deep dive into this, and the healthcare industry, I think, is quite instructive in this. From the depth of the recession to 2016, in San Diego region, we added 24,000 healthcare jobs. Very robust growth, bigger than any other sector. But we actually saw the average wage in the healthcare industry decrease by about $5,000 over that time. And that was because we weren't necessarily adding doctors and highly skilled nurses. We were adding home health care aides. We were adding people who work in nursing homes, people who work in minute clinics, who are on the lower end of healthcare. So the healthcare industry is a good example of that very thing, where we're adding a lot of lower skilled jobs. About 70% of the jobs that we added during the recovery of the Great Recession were below the median wage. So the real median wage actually did come down. This data up in the upper right hand tends to be a little noisy, so I wouldn't necessarily panic and say that San Diegans' wages are generally falling. But it is, we have looked at this fairly closely, and we're not seeing the rises in San Diego's real wages when adjusted for inflation that we're seeing on the national level, mostly because of our inflation rate is higher, because of housing prices are higher.
So next I'll touch on our debt portfolio, and I think one of the big things that happened since the last time we presented to you is the line item there in blue, and that we completed the sale of our 2018 Series A short-term notes. And if you'll recall, these are actually AA rated as opposed to our senior lien that is AAA rated, the highest level for from both S&P and Fitch. However, there was really great demand for the bonds. We went into the market. There were 24 investors that ended up purchasing our bonds. And so we were actually able to price 4 basis points below AAA levels. So they actually graded these as even better than AAA. So, you may think, well, what's the big deal about that? But for every basis point, it's $160,000 in savings. So 4 basis points, we actually ended up saving approximately $640,000 in interest costs. So we're very happy with the performance of the sale. Now, one of the things that we just talked about, interest rates are going up pretty substantially, and the good thing is that we were able to get in and get out last April. If we had actually priced the bonds just yesterday, it kind of took a calculation, took a look at it, and we would have paid an additional $3.2 million in interest costs. So we actually got in at a fairly opportune time. Interesting thing too is that the proceeds that we received, we've invested them in the California Asset Management Program. That's earning approximately $195 now, plus some individual portfolio. We book some treasuries and commercial paper, earning over 2%. So we're actually earning more on our proceeds than what we're paying to investors right now. So for the first time in many years, we actually have positive arbitrage. Now, obviously, we're going to spend down the proceeds, so we're not going to make too much, but right now we're actually making more in interest than we're actually paying. It doesn't happen that often, but it's just the dynamics of the interest rate market right now.
Aren't there laws governing against that, or is it there's some period of time that you're allowed to?
So there's a spend down requirement that you have to spend down the proceeds in a certain time period, usually over 3 years, and if you can spend the proceeds down, you can keep the money. So yeah, so right now it's kind of unusual. I think there's only been a couple other times that we've actually had positive arbitrage going back to the early 90s when we started issuing paper. So just to remind you again, why did we issue this paper? You can see our overall cost was $186, including all our issuance costs, and then you can see the very line item below, the $272. That's the commitment amount that we have from TIFIA. So we basically said that if we issue this paper now and then take these notes out with the TIFIA loan in 3 years, our savings turned out to be almost $14 million. So this was kind of financial engineering, and the fact that, well, part of it is financial engineering, part of it was that TIFIA wanted us to have substantial completion of the project before they loaned to us. So issuing these short-term notes as opposed to issuing the TIFIA upfront saved us $14 million. And then just kind of looking overall at some of our metrics now, based on the lower rate of the 186 compared to our other rates which are more in the mid-3s, brought down our overall cost of capital to 3.34%. And then based on the most recent sales tax that we received through March, which were approximately 4% higher than last year, our initial forecast had said 2.5%, so we're running a little bit higher than that, which obviously is good news. So our overall debt service coverage ratio has gone up to 2.78 times.
Why is there so much that's still in the outstanding par? Is that's what you haven't drawn on, correct? Or what? Can you
No,
explain that?
the difference between the initial, original issuance versus outstanding pars, outstanding pars, what's outstanding we're paying debt on. So if you look at the very first 2008, we initially issued 600,000, but we have outstanding 402,000. Part of that we actually defease. Part of it is actually we're paying down principal, right, over the next 40 years as our debt comes due. So that's basically every 6 months we pay interest, and every 12 months we pay principal. So we're still up.
Andre?
Yes.
You've done this to me at least before. You talked about your debt ratio, your debt coverage ratio for your senior level debt. When I go to the bank, they want to see what all debts are. Last time I looked at your report, it was something like 2.1 when you included all debt.
That's correct.
But why do you doesn't that bother you?
Maybe we'll get into the next chart and I'll talk about it. But overall, I guess we could provide that. Would be just another number, which we can. But ultimately, let's get into the next one.
Okay, we do owe that money, though.
We do owe that money.
Okay, keep going. Thank you.
So the next chart, and maybe I can just take a minute to, I know that, Ariana, did you get the?
Yeah, we passed out.
Okay. So in front of you is the official statement from the very last bond issuance that we did, the 2018 series. Along with it is a letter from our attorneys, our bond counsel. I think a couple months ago, Dick had questioned, I think where you're getting to, Jonathan, is our coverage looking at our major corridors. I think his concern is when I talk about our debt service coverage, that's for the overall program. And whereas for our major corridor program, which is borrowing the majority of these funds, maybe over 98% of it goes towards the major corridors, is how are we faring? And I think his question is, from a bond indenture standpoint and what we've told investors, are we okay? And basically what our attorney says there, that whatever we've disclosed to bond investors through our official statements and whatever is in our bond indenture, there's absolutely nothing that we're doing wrong. Now, if you do look at our major corridor program, and I think this is where Dick's question comes, is we're fairly close to the coverage. I think our board policy 36, and there's a section on page 6 if you want to take a look at it, states that each one of the programs should have sufficient revenues coming in to pay for their debts. And after issuing the 2018 series, we get very close on the major corridor program. You can see that dotted line is the revenues that we have, that we project to receive over the next, through 2048, and what our debt service coverage is. Now, Jim spoke about we're kind of going on to a pay-as-you-go program. We maybe have one bond issuance left, a small one. The balance of what you see over here is pretty much what our debt service is going to look like. And you can see in 2019, 2020, we're very close to the revenue line as far as what revenue is going to be versus debt service. In fact, it's 1.01 times above, which is very close. If we were to go into a recession, the good news is if they're saying a recession in 2020, at 2020 the coverage gets to 1.06 times. So if there's a recession and our sales tax fall by 2 or 3%, then we still have a little bit of cushion. If we were to go into a recession in 2019, that may not look very pretty. We may go under 1. I think the one thing to understand, though, is our debt policy is a guide as to what we're supposed to do. Now, we, on an annual basis, do the plan of finance to make sure that the debt that we're issuing is very close. Obviously, we know that with the Mid-Coast project, that the most intense spending we have is in 2019, 20, and 21. But the one thing that we have to kind of mitigating that is currently, as of December, we have approximately $600 million in fund balance. So if we were to dip and we go into recession in 2019, we have enough reserves to make payments. And then you can see after the 2021, we pretty comfortably fit under what we estimate going forward based on our sales tax projections are fairly conservative, approximately 3% growth per year. So I think the letter that our attorney has attached, or I've given you the plan, I think also emailed it to you, basically says that when investors look at our program, they don't look necessarily at individual, like the major corridor versus other programs. They look as the program as a whole. And basically when we collect money from the Board of Equalization after paying their admin fees, all of that money goes first towards debt service, then we get the money for projects. So anything that we've told our investors in our official statements and our bond documents, they should have no concern, and we should have no concern as far as what we've told them.
Does that chart say that our debt coverage service today for all debt is 1.0?
That is for the major corridor program itself. Overall, it's the number that I showed you before, the 2.78. But for this particular program,
that's only for the major, for the money. Okay.
And again, we look at our plan of finance on an annual basis, and so we knew this was coming, and we planned for this, going back 3 or 4 years. So we've tried to issue as much debt as we can to be as efficient as we can, and get the project built. Good news is after 2022, you can see, we're pretty much in the clear. We get back to about a 1.23 times coverage here, which is a lot more comfortable, obviously.
Thank you.
So the last part is, I guess, kind of looking forward. We've had a busy, the last 12 months we issued the TIFIA debt, or at least we have it ready for us at 2.72% rate, which is great today. As Jim mentioned, even the 10-year treasury is over at 3% or close to it. Then last October we issued or refinanced the SR 125 debt, saved $147 million there, and then just having done this transaction last month, saved approximately $14 million, the difference between the two. So we've had a busy 12 months. We're going to take a little bit of a break, but probably coming up before the end of this calendar year, we'll be talking about issuing GANs, which is Grant Anticipation Notes. As you know, we're getting $1 billion from the federal government. That's $100 million per year over the next 10 years. But this project is going to be built by 2021. So what we need to do is bring forward some of those dollars so we can pay for it. So we'll be looking to do another bond issuance. This time it'll be based on our federal grant as opposed to our sales tax. So it will be a little more challenging. I think investors are a lot more confident in our sales tax that we have versus the federal government. So it'll be a little more challenging, a little more work, but just wanted to give you a heads up that that'll be coming by the end of this year. That's all. That answers your question.
Thank you, guys. That is the end of our agenda. Just future meeting, next meeting is June 13th at 9:30. We not up their head will not be able to attend. June 13th, 9:30.
Well, I'll be here, I think.
Okay. And with that, we move adjournment.
So moved.
Second?